And so now we begin our look at the final topic for this 1607 to 1754 era of U.S. history, with a look at colonial society and culture. In particular, we will be looking at how and why the movement of a variety of people and ideas across the Atlantic contributed to the development of American culture over time. In addition, we will look at how and why the different goals and interests of European leaders and colonists affected how they viewed themselves and their relationship with Britain. In doing so, we will be concentrating on the themes of American and regional culture, as well as American and national identity. During the late 17th and into the 18th centuries, the population of the colonies was growing fairly rapidly. There was still a tremendous amount of immigration from Europe, primarily England, but other places as well. But with families flourishing, especially in the New England colonies, populations were growing naturally too. Once those who did come to the colonies arrived, they tended to have larger families, especially those on farms, since there wasn't as much of a worry about being able to feed a large family as there had been in England. Over time, natural birth became the leading source of population increase, and the population was nearly doubling every 20 to 30 years. The worst difficulties of early settlement were over, and cities and towns were growing in number and in size. Remember, though, not all immigrants came willingly, as you also have the forced migration of African peoples contributing to this population increase. But it is important to know that all of this combined to create a wide variety of religious and ethnic groups, all coming together to create a relatively diverse society, at least more so than in England itself. As America was becoming more diverse ethnically and culturally, they were also becoming more diverse religiously. Protestantism was still dominant, but other religious groups like Jews and Catholics were practicing their beliefs as well. Many had arrived in the colonies in the first place seeking a religious refuge, but over time, religious fervor had decreased. In the 1660s in New England, ministers, troubled by the lack of conversions, which would allow individuals to gain full membership into the Congregationalist Church, came up with a halfway covenant, which would allow the baptism of children of those who had not yet undergone a full conversion themselves. Still, the waning interest in religion was decreasing church membership and support. But by the 1730s, this was beginning to change. A new revival began that was a different kind of movement because it focused on human sin and their need to repent in order to be saved. This revival would come to be called the Great Awakening. It emphasized the heart over the head with reference to spiritual matters, and became a massive religious revival that swept through all the colonies and generated an intense Christian devotion and enthusiasm. Two of the most famous preachers to emerge from this movement were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Edwards was a New England minister and a scholar who preached sermons that combined Enlightenment ideas, which we'll talk about in a minute, with intense religious fervor. Perhaps his most famous sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which tried to scare believers into being better souls, claiming that hell was, quote, paved with the skulls of unbaptized children, unquote. Although this could be seen as gruesome, most of his sermons actually had more to do with the joyful aspects of God and his presence in the actions of others. George Whitefield was English by birth and had been part of the Methodist revival in England. He traveled to America, and once here he took the message of God's salvation by grace and Jesus Christ to all of the colonies, traveling more than 5,000 miles up and down the eastern seaboard, giving over 350 sermons to people up and down the Atlantic coast. Whitefield preached to common people, to slaves, to Native Americans. No one was out of reach. His success convinced English colonists to join local churches and re-energized a once waning Christian faith. This Great Awakening created even more religious denominations because of the significant schism in the Congregational churches, particularly in New England. Those embracing the new thinking would be dubbed New Lights, and those that did not, Old Lights. And the New Lights would eventually branch out, founding various new Protestant denominations, such as Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Evangelicals. One of the major influencing factors on this religious revival was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that began in Europe and emphasized ideas such as a belief in science and reason or rational thinking over tradition and religious revelation. The equality of all people, the idea that individuals can control their own destiny, and the political ideas associated with democracy and republicanism. This movement became popular in the colonies because of a strong transatlantic print culture, which spread the Enlightenment thinkers' ideas to the American colonists. There were some printing presses in the colonies producing a variety of pamphlets, but longer works were still commonly printed in Europe and imported through the various trade networks. And since a significant proportion of Americans knew how to read, a greater proportion than even in Britain, many read works by these Enlightenment figures. There was a challenge to America's free press when John Peter Zenger, the publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, was accused of libel. He had published something that was critical of a royal governor that had been appointed to the colonies, and was accused of printing libel because the things that he printed were damaging to the governor's image, which is what libel is. At trial, the judge ultimately said that it was not libel because what the publisher was printing was true, and truth could not be libel, even if the statements were damaging. This then began a tradition of newspapers being able to criticize colonial governments and royal governors, and setting up a tradition of freedom of the press. One of the most important of these Enlightenment philosophers was John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises on government, which focused on ideas of self-government and natural law. Natural rights, or natural law, was the idea that human beings, simply by virtue of existing, had rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and property, that were given to them not by a monarch, but by a creator. Other significant philosophers included Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and Immanuel Kant, who suggested the ideas of a government made up of equally powerful branches that could check the power of the other branches of government. They also helped to develop the idea that sovereignty rested with the people, and that the people willingly gave up some of that power to a government who would, in turn, protect their natural rights. If that government then abused that power, then it was perfectly reasonable to overthrow it. But we'll look more at that in the next unit. Yet another idea that grew out of this Enlightenment also tied into the Great Awakening. Since some of the older Protestant denominations were being supported by taxes, when new groups arose out of the Great Awakening, there was a movement to separate church and state, so that one church was not getting preferential treatment, often in the form of more financial support, since they were being funded by everyone's taxes. The Great Awakening had a number of important effects on American life, society, and culture. For example, it continued the Puritans' emphasis on education, led to women's increased participation in the church, and spread the Christian gospel to many people. Revivalists, like the Puritans, encouraged literacy and education in order to promote Bible reading and prepare ministers and missionaries. To encourage Bible study, revivalist ministers often provided basic reading education to their congregations, especially in rural areas where there were few schools. Several evangelical colleges were founded in the mid-1700s for such Bible-based and missionary educational purposes, including Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth universities. Colonists also took up such humane causes and often ministered to and helped the poor, sick, needy, and uneducated. By the 1700s, women made up the majority of church membership in all denominations. While men continued to exercise religious authority, women's increased religious activities during this period led to greater participation of women in American churches. Some churches supported greater women's activism, giving women more direct church roles, the ability to vote on congregational matters, and even management of philanthropic groups. Though the Great Awakening did not resolve the issue of slavery, it brought the Christian gospel more directly to all classes and groups of people, including the Native Americans and African Americans, many of whom were slaves. This would get hope to slaves, and churches by and for Black Americans gradually appeared. When revivalist preacher George Whitefield died, Phyllis Wheatley, an emancipated slave and America's first published Black female poet, wrote her first published poem as a memorial to Whitefield. It addressed the hope that Whitefield brought to African Americans. In addition, Since the American colonies were part of the vast British Empire, and many of the immigrants were from England, they would imitate English political, economic, and cultural characteristics. Politically, the colonies created their governments based on the British model. Most colonies had a governor and a legislature, with an upper house and a lower house, a form of government that reflected the structure of the British king and his parliament. Each colony had a representative in London to help both London and the colonies mediate potential problems. English common law was used throughout the colonies, and colonists believed that they enjoyed the rights of European Englishmen, such as the right to liberty, equality, and to own private property. The colonial judicial system also looked like the Old World, with county courts and local judges handling issues of justice. Economically, the colonies were part of the British mercantile system, as we've already seen. Officially, according to the Navigation Acts, colonists could only trade with England, and only English ships could be used to transport goods, and ships bound for the colonies had to go through English ports. This affected where the colonists could sell their goods and what they could buy, if they followed the law. Culturally, the people of the coastal urban areas of the colonies seemingly tried to mimic the rich, gentrified aristocrats of upper-class England. They would drink tea, go fox hunting, read the local newspapers, and attend balls and dinner parties while following the rules of proper etiquette. They enjoyed nice silks and linens and used fancy ceramic dinnerware before retiring to lounge areas after dinner to smoke tobacco and discuss important matters of the day. As you moved away from the cities, though, the focus was still primarily on survival and immediate family life. Because of the growing population and expanding territory, the British Parliament was having difficulty governing this increasingly complex situation. Salutary neglect led to the American desire for self-rule and independence. So many colonies formed self-governing structures like participatory town meetings and colonial legislatures. And as Enlightenment thinkers awakened American colonists to the ideas about liberty and rights and democratic government, they learned to resist threats to democracy. And so although the colonies were experiencing a gradual Anglicanization, which is to say they were becoming more British-like, they also began to grow frustrated with the British as well, and that led to resistance, and we're going to talk a lot more about colonial resistance to Britain in the next unit. Colonists were also eager to keep moving west, as land was beginning to fill up in the coastal areas, but because of westward expansion, there were more land disputes with natives and other European powers. 3 European wars had already spread to the American colonies by the 1740s, putting the British colonies into conflict with Spanish in Florida, as well as the French and their Native American allies to the north and west. Because of the possibility of more wars, the Crown and the royal governors were not willing to guarantee continued expansion and defense for that expansion, which angered many colonists. In addition, issues of trade and the policies of mercantilism restricted the growth of the American economy, keeping it dependent on Britain. Many protested this rule by smuggling colonial products to the French West Indies and elsewhere, emphasizing a growing rebellious attitude. Some of the foundations of colonial resistance to British imperialism are linked to the aftermath of the series of wars, often called the Wars for Empire. King William's War, from 1689 to 1697, or the War of the League of Augsburg in Europe, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1711, or the War of the Spanish Succession in Europe, and King George's War, 1744 to 1748, or the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe. These conflicts were extensions of wars that had erupted on the European mainland or in the high seas over the balance of power, expansionism, mercantilism, and Indian alliances. Bloody fighting along the frontiers of the northern British colonies in New France had cost many colonial lives for territory that was then returned to the pre-war claimant in the final peace treaty in exchange for territorial concessions in India, leaving many in the colonies angered that their sacrifices had seemingly meant so little. In the area of trade, the existence of the Navigation Acts, particularly the last one enacted in 1696, led to increased colonial resistance because the law now prevented colonists from appointing customs officials themselves. Instead, they would be appointed by the commissioners of the Treasury and Customs in England. The law also overturned colonial laws that contradicted any part of the Navigation Acts and even mandated who could serve in certain official positions in the colonies. The law even attempted to regulate land sales, which seemed to limit land sales in America to only natural-born subjects of England, Ireland, the Dominion of Wales, without the consent of the king. Colonial-born subjects were not mentioned in the law. In addition, the government started to institute admiralty courts in more places to try cases involving violations of the law, and often these courts were in England, leading to heavy expense for anyone in the colonies accused of violating them. Then, when the Molasses Act was passed in 1733, it levied heavy taxes on the trade of sugar from the French West Indies into America, so that the colonists would be forced to buy sugar from the British West Indies, which was more expensive. Though that law was widely ignored through smuggling efforts, attempts to enforce the law increased hostilities between Britain and the colonies over the issue of trade. And a final root of resistance to British imperialism lay in the actions of the popularly elected legislatures. They had often exercised checks of the power of the royally appointed governors, such as withholding their salaries. It was a way for the colonies to show that they were the dominant ones in these systems, but England began to take notice and enact legislation weakening the power of colonial legislatures while increasing the power of colonial governors. Although they had experience in self-government, colonists did not have a vote in Parliament, or even able to vote on who represented them in Parliament, leading some colonists to take issue with this idea of virtual representation. Because of the evolving ideas of liberty often influenced by the political thoughts of the Enlightenment, the colonists were therefore becoming more and more aware of violations to their natural rights, and they were increasingly rebelling against such violations. And that is going to have some pretty significant consequences in the next time period.